Hello and welcome to this joint FREYA and OpenAIRE webinar on the new developments in the field of persistent identifiers. And we have two excellent presenters with us today. So our first speaker is Ketil Koop-Jakobsen from PANGAEA and Bremen University in Germany. And he will speak about FREYA project and new persistent identifiers developments. And our second speaker is Dr. Amir Aryani, and he's a head of SODA lab in the Swinburne University of Technology, and he's also on the board of directors of Research Graph Foundation. And my name is Iryna Kuchma, and I work for OpenAIRE, and I will talk how OpenAIRE uses persistent identifiers. And Ketil, would you like to start your presentation? And
yes.
For questions, please use either webinar chat functionality or Q&A functionality, and we'll answer the questions. And it is supposed to be interactive, so please type as many questions as you can. Thank you, and please, Ketil, over to you.
Yeah. And that's good. Up here. I'm sorry. I have some issues here. Okay, we're here.
Try that.
Okay, all right, I can do that. That's good. Okay, now I'm shared. Now we're here. Sorry about that. A little technical problems with the toolbar that was in the way of making my presentation to full screen. But here we are. So today, I would very much like to thank you for joining this joint webinar from FREYA and OpenAIRE. And my name is Ketil Koop-Jakobsen. I'm from PANGAEA at Bremen University. PANGAEA is a data publisher, and we work with data from many different scientific disciplines. Our primary area is in the natural sciences. Today, I'm going to talk about the project FREYA and the new developments that we have done within the area of PID developments. The FREYA project, just a little introduction to what it is that we are doing. Overall, we are concerned with connecting open identifiers for discovery and access and use of research resources. Well, in a nutshell, that actually means that FREYA is all concerned with the use of persistent identifiers. And if we take this little citation here from our description of work, well, then it explains what it is that we are actually doing, and that is to extend the infrastructure for persistent identifiers as a core component of open research in the EU and globally. And what that means is that FREYA is concerned with facilitating a better infrastructure for persistent identifiers, meaning we are not the guys who are actually producing the PIDs, but we are the people who are facilitating a better infrastructure to connect existing and emerging PIDs. FREYA is a Horizon 2020 project funded by the European Commission. We build on two preceding projects that some of you may have heard of that also were concerned with persistent identifiers, namely Thor and Odin. FREYA started in December 2017, so we are a little bit more than a year into our work now. And if you would like to see more about what it is that we do, then please take a look at our webpage that you can see here. And also you can follow us on Twitter. One of the things that really characterizes FREYA is that we work interdisciplinarily. and that we draw on expertise from a very diverse group of partners. And as you can see here, we have all our partners listed. We have DataCite, Crossref, PLOS, CERN, British Library, STFC, Pangea, Hundawi, DANS, ANS, EMBL. So a very diverse group, including data repositories, publishers, research institutions, PID providers, and libraries. This means that we can actually face the challenges about improving the infrastructure for PIDs from many different angles and representing many different scientific disciplines. One of the things when you hear about FREYA is that you will pretty much always be presented a PID graph. A PID graph is our basic tool that we work around. And here we have a PID graph, a basic one that illustrates how different PIDs that are already existing for the most part is connected. And let me just walk you through the graph, and then afterwards I will extend it so you can see what we mean by expanding it to include new PID types. Okay, so we have a situation here. If you follow my mouse here, you can see that we have author 1 and author 2. They both have an ORCID, that's their PID. Together, they make a publication. That publication goes to the publisher, it's accepted, it's published, it gets a DOI. The publication has now a PID. The author PID, the ORCID, is included in the publication, and the publication DOI is included in the ORCID page of each author. So they're interconnected. The publication is based on a data set. That data set could come from the author, in which case there would be a link between the data set and the author, but it can also come from an open repository, like, for instance, here at Pangea, where I work, where we have data sets from all different kinds of disciplines available. So you can actually search our database, find a data set that suits your purposes, and the data sets that we have available are curated and published and have a PID in form of a DOI. So the dataset PID is included in the publication and linked to the author through the publication. Now, in order to analyze this dataset that the author found, he or she might have used a software. This could be a software that's available from a repository like Zenodo, for instance. And also there, the software can be given a PID. So the software that is used to analyze the dataset can be included in the publication and linked to the PIDs of the author. So in this way, we are FREYA is trying to link different PIDs. So what I talked to you about here, that pretty much already exists. But if we go on to talk about institution, well, then it becomes more difficult because there's no clear PID scheme for institutions. If we talk about new PID types like organizations, there are definitely people working on assigning PIDs for organizations. Also within FREYA, some of our partners are involved with that. And the progress is ongoing, but there's not a mature PID system for organizations yet either. Then there's a sample. A data set might have been generated from a physical sample that exists somewhere, and that sample has the opportunity of having a PID. There are PID systems for samples out there, the IGSN number, for instance, but it only covers like a certain part of the physical samples that could be available. I'll get into that later. Then there's instruments. The instruments that were used to analyze the sample to generate the data set that goes into the publication. Now, there is a lot of this debate about PIDs for instruments right now because there's a great need for it. It would be great to have a PID that can identify the instrument that was used to analyze the sample. However, this is not an easy task because where do you start giving a PID to an instrument? Do you give it to a platform that has several instruments on it? Do you give it to an instrument itself that can be identified as an individual unit? But what if you have an instrument that consists of several sensors? Do you give each sensor a PID? And what if you then recalibrate the sensors after 2 years? Well, then the whole foundation for the way that the instrument works is different. Do you assign a new PID in that case? Or do you leave it as it is? Well, these are challenges that I mentioned here that I know there is a very nice group in RDA that is working on that right now. But there's definitely a need for an instrument PID. Other new PIDs also could include data repositories needs a PID, the grants that is funding it, all the research. I mean, there are PIDs, but we need a more universal system here. Conferences need a PID. So this is what we in FREYA mean about extending the PID graph to also include new PIDs. But the question is, where do we start? Which new PIDs are the most important? Which are the easiest ones to take to the next level where they are actually easily implemented? That is some of the questions that we are concerned with in FREYA. So in order to analyze the landscape of the new PIDs, we did an assessment of the PIDs that are out there and identified the gaps. So, which basically means the PID systems that we need, but is not there yet, or is there in a still developing form. And the way that we did that was that we explored the need for these PIDs by asking for use cases from the community. And I'm going to get into what I mean by that in just a little bit. But all of this enabled us to identify the requirements for new potential PIDs. So 3 bullet points on what FREYA is doing on the new PID landscape is, first of all, we assessed the current landscape of new PIDs. That is done. There's a report. You can look it up on our webpage. What we're doing right now is we're trying to identify the needs for new PIDs and their requirements. This is something that's almost done. There'll be a report in a couple of months. And then finally, what we would like to do is to develop prototypes for new PID types, but that is a task that is still in progress. But if we start up with defining the PID landscape, then we did an analysis of the entire PID landscape, looking at what's there, what's existing, what are the PID initiatives, what's emerging, what are people talking about, what do they need, and what is the maturity of all of these PIDs that we could possibly find out there in the different research communities from all different scientific disciplines. Well, altogether, we found or identified 25 entities. And by entities, I mean things that could potentially be assigned a PID, like publications, conferences, researchers, organizations, data, and so on and so forth. These entities either have a PID or need a PID. However, this is also not a simple task because there might be a significant overlap among different disciplines, and that actually complicates it when we want to determine the maturity. For instance, we can here talk about samples again. Well, samples, for geological samples, there is an existing PID system, the IGSN number. But if we talk about cultural artifacts, well, then there is no good system for PIDs in this regard, even though a cultural artifact can actually also be a physical sample. Well, then there's something like historical persona. Well, this is a persona. It needs a PID for persons, but it doesn't really fit the ORCID system. Well, if we talk about the remains of a historical person, well, then we can call it a physical sample, but there's also no good PID in this regard. But altogether, for all of these 25 entities, we identified the PID types that are already there, and we assigned them a maturity level. And there were actually only 3 entities, researchers, publications, and data, that have services that are deemed fully mature. The rest of them are either emerging, which means that there is a PID system, but it's under development, or they're immature, which means that people are talking about the needs for a PID system, but they're not there yet. You can see a report on this on our webpage. Then we move on and talk about identifying needs and requirements for new PIDs. And this is where the use cases come into the picture, because the method that we chose to use for identifying the needs and requirements for new PIDs was we asked the community, the research community concerned with PIDs and PID assignment, for use cases. And I'm going to show you in a little bit what a use case is in this regard. But we got a lot of information here also from conferences where we asked the audience to give us use cases. These use cases enabled us to identify PIDs, new PIDs in high demand, and identify the requirements for the progress of these new PIDs. So what is a use case in the FREYA context? A use case in FREYA describes a scenario where a PID is needed, identifying a user, a goal, and its benefits. And it basically follows the template that you can see here on the right-hand side. As a user, could be a researcher, I want a PID for instruments, that is my goal, so that I can track all the publications that comes out of this new instrument. That's a benefit I as a user gain from having this new PID. And we collected a lot of use cases in a lot of different areas. Just to give you a few of the headlines here, we have cross-linking literature and data via instruments, linking published metadata with instrument metadata, tracking reuse of software, and tracing outcome of research cruises. So we have a very diverse collection of use cases. I'm going to give you some examples in just a little bit, but just a little bit about the numbers. So altogether, we collected 72 use cases in total, and from 30 of them, we could identify a use case that revolved around what we would call a new PID, emerging or immature. So just to give you an example here about what the use cases were that we collected, and we have one use case that revolves around research cruises. So it says, as a funding agency, I would like to trace the outcome of my financial contribution to a marine research cruise by tracking the data generated and articles, physical samples, and I would also like to track the future data and publications generated from my cruise and the samples it collected. So if we boil this down, then it's a funding agency that would like a research cruise ID so that it can track the future outcome of their investments. We have another use case that revolves around software. It says, as a software author, I want to be able to see the citations of my software aggregated across all versions so that I see a complete picture of reuse. So if we boil this down, the user is a software author. He or she wants a software PID in order to track reuse, which is the benefit for this particular user. We have a use case that revolves around policy, and it's from a research manager that says, as a research manager, I want to have policy IDs so that I can easily identify relevant policies and assess the compatibility between different policies. So here we have, a research manager who is the user, who wants a policy PID, that's the goal, in order to benefit from being able to assess compatibility between different policies. So from all of these 30 use cases, we made what we call a popularity index. So how many times were different PIDs and need for PIDs mentioned in these use cases? Some use cases had more than, most of them actually had more than one PID mentioned. So that's why the total number here adds up to more than 30. But still, what we could see from this was that there is a really big demand for instrument PIDs. There's a lot of talk and a lot of need for development of a PID for instruments. A lot of other entities were mentioned in these use cases. So what we're going on in FREYA and analyzing further is not only instruments, but also repositories, organizations, physical samples, grants, and software. And we added a few that we have personal interests in from the partners within FREYA, the research campaigns, the data management plans, and facilities. So these are the 9 PID systems that we are taking on for further analysis. And what we want to do with them is that we want to identify the needs based on the user stories. So why do the users want this particular PID? And we want to validate the current status. I mean, here we can draw on the experience that we have from our landscape analysis, but we want to analyze what it takes to expand this PID type to a level where it can be used more frequently. And this validation also includes a cross-disciplinary approach. And here I would like to dwell a little bit on the physical samples again, because I find them really interesting. We had user stories that all labeled physical samples that revolved around information about sediment cores in a repository, and tracing and relocating misplaced cultural artifacts, and on top of that, identifying samples of bacterial, viral, and fungal strains. And as I told you before, we have PID systems that are to some extent working in these areas, but they're not fully covering all of them. And so our goal here is to analyze what is out there and what it takes to actually find a system that'll work. Well, maybe not for all of these different kinds of physical samples together, but then in itself will also be a result if we can say, okay, we need a split or we need to try to merge them. Altogether, this should end up in a report that'll be available by the end of February. And we can then try to match the requirements and the needs with the expertise that we have in FREYA in order to see how we can move forward in terms of prototyping some of these PIDs. I'm not going to go too much into the prototyping now, but just to give you a little bit of an example of how we want to improve the infrastructure for these new and emerging PIDs. I want to give you a use case here from Pangea on how we have implemented the IGSN numbers. So I've set this up as a use case scenario. I'm a geologist. I'm interested in sediment cores. It has come to my knowledge through my search of all the literature available that there's something going on in the French Alps. They're taking some very interesting samples there, and I want to find out what data is available. So I searched in Pangea, and I found out that Banyat et al. 2015, they have published data, and that is very interesting, and I would actually like to know more about it. So what kind of information do I get from the PIDs that are implemented in the data set in Pangea? So first of all, we have a PID for the authors. So most of the authors here have an ORCID, and the ORCID is actionable. So when we click on the ORCID, well then, here we go. When we click on the ORCID, as you can see here, well then we will be directed directly to the ORCID webpage where we have additional information about the author. In the dataset, there is also a PID for the data. Well, this is the one that we're actually looking at, and that is what we will use if we need to use the dataset and cite it in another publication. On top of that, we have the article PID that is also actionable, and it'll take us directly to the journal webpage where you will find the actual article where this data was published. So these are the mature PIDs that I talked about. What we have added further in Pangea, and in particular to this data set here, is we have implemented the IGSN numbers, the numbers for the cores that we're taking in the French Alps to generate this particular data set. These cores are stored in a core repository and have been assigned a PID. And that is now available also in the data set from Pangea here. And this means that it's actionable, and it'll take you to the IGSN webpage where you can get information about this particular core, where these data come from, what kind of material, where it was collected, and where it's potentially stored at the moment. So if you wanted to, you could actually trace it down, go get it, get a sample, and do your own analysis. This is a little bit of a view of what it is that we would like to expand the new PIDs to also be included in this kind of information here. To finish up, just out in conclusion, our use case-oriented method gave practical orientation about the user's demand for new PIDs. And we could see that in particular, PIDs for instruments, organizations, physical samples, grants, and software were in high demand by the community. The implementation of some of these new PIDs will definitely improve the user's access to additional information. And that is what we're trying to pave the way, the way for here in FREYA. And with that, that ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ketil. Are there any burning clarification questions to Ketil right now? Because if there are, please type them in the chat or Q&A functionality. If there are no, well, I can see a raised hand, but let me see if I can allow Peter to speak. I just allowed you to talk if you want to ask a question, Peter. Maybe it's easy if you type your question in a chat.
I think Peter is still mute.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out, how to unmute.
It might be unmute from Peter's side because it says talking permitted.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, Peter is saying that he doesn't really have a question right now. Shall we continue with Amir? And please think about your questions for Ketil and also for Amir.
Okay, so thanks, Iryna. Let me start. Okay, so now I think in the second talk, I'm gonna go a bit across a couple of different, if you like, more philosophical perspective around the PIDs and connecting the scholarly works. And I think if it would be in a way complementary to what Ketil said about creating the PID graph. But I'm going to basically look at the PID graph more as a user or as the infrastructure that use the PID infrastructure rather than a PID provider. So while I have been fortunate enough to work with the PID infrastructure system is almost about 6 years, and all of this time we actually use this platform for a big bulk of connecting scholarly works. So in this presentation, what I'm going to do, I thought in the short time that we have, I can talk about a bit of background that where and how the working group in the Research Data Alliance got to the point to leverage the PID infrastructure. I will talk about a kind of bleeding edge technology that right now in this space using the PID and PID graph underneath. And also I have a couple of points about the PID graph, so that would be almost aligned with the same things that Ketil mentioned. And also the other thing is that this slide set is almost abstract version of a 1 hour talk. So there is a lot of things here that I'm going to actually jump over the topics. I'm going to mention them, but we wouldn't have enough time to actually looking at the details. If there is a need for further discussion, we can always have an offline conversation about any of the quote-unquote jargons that I'm going to mention as part of the presentation. Now, well, on the background side, back in about 6 years ago, we had a problem, which is still a lot of repositories still have that problem. And that is finding the related data sets. If you are running a data infrastructure, if you are a researcher who is searching in a data infrastructure for a data set, or if you just randomly come across a paper that cited a data set, when you're looking at that data set, you think, okay, what are the other data sets on the internet that are linked to this? Now, in the concept of paper, we have the paper citation and our discovery tools, and these days you have a Microsoft Academic Graph and Google Scholars and lots of different services that provide you with overall context around the publications and the scholarly works in that space. But when it gets to the data, our options are very limited. Google recently launched a data search platform, but still that wouldn't directly address the problem of looking at individual data set and find the related work to this. Now, this was the issue for a group of data infrastructures and lots of people in this space. In very early days in 2013, this led to creation of the working group that called Data Description Registry Interoperability. The idea was finding better ways for connecting research data across multiple infrastructure points. And one of the earlier partners in this project was Dryad, CERN, and ANTS. And I'm going to use some of that data to show you the sort of works that we did in the beginning to actually find some way to actually address this problem. Now, this is a screenshot from the Research Data Australia. That's a service that's hosted by Australian National Data Service in Australia. And we are looking at one page here, which is a description of a data set. On the right side, you can see some similar data sets linked to this, but assume that that thing is not there. If you only have the information in the middle, you probably, if you search for information related to this, you have multiple different options. In the old days, we actually used to grab a title or related keywords and search in the data site REST services or other related things to find related data sets. Now, the working group at the time thought, okay, well, we can do better. Let's do a different method. Let's actually, looking at the name of the author, we can Google the name of the author. We will find a page of the researcher, which is Professor Catherine Belov in the University of Sydney. We can go to that page. We can go look at all the articles. We can read the individual articles. And in one of those, we will find a link to a data set in a Dryad repository, which is actually, in this case, has a persistent identifier. We go to that repository, and we find another data set by the same author, which in this case actually has a different name or different abbreviation of that name. It's called Belov K. So what happened here is actually we went from a data set to a researcher, from a researcher to a publication, and from a publication to another data set. We technically connected two different data sets by presenting the concept that they might be related. We don't know if they are directly related, but they're conceptually related. They are produced either by the same author or they are referenced in the same publication. So there are some links in that space that connect this information together. That was the point of the DDRI working group, and the work that we did was around developing this model to find this, or make it production level service, so the repository can use this for connecting the data sets in their own infrastructure. The work was led to creating a piece of software system that called Research Data Switchboard, and it was basically automating the same process that I explained. It was using the Google API to link the information across internet. And one of the things it was doing that was important, it was resolving all the identifiers. And it was building a model that later on got the name of the research graph. Now, the core of this activity comes back to connecting different scholarly works and scholarly assets using technically 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So examples here on the screen, there are 2 degrees of separation. We have 2 data sets that are cited by the same paper. We have 2 data sets that are funded by the same grant. And we have 2 data sets that are created by the same researcher. And the difference between this and the concept of data citation is that we don't know any causality in this. There is no direct relationship between these 2 data sets. We just have some evidence that they might be related. The formation of this work underneath with some other studies that, as I said, we don't have enough time to go through this, showed this is actually quite a strong evidence to find related information across the web. We published a paper in the Scientific Data with a cluster of our records that was curated for the purpose of public use. And in that Nature article, one of the things that we found was in our curated data set, 70% of our publications have DOI, and 46% of our data sets have DOI. Now, the significance of this is that when we were curating this graph, if you like, for the nature, we were trying to find the clusters that are highly connected, so rather than have lots of scattered information. It was more focused on finding interconnected information. And that was an interesting observation. Again, this was a quite small case study with a very limited information. And the most of the DOI that we get obviously here from the data site and Crossref, but it doesn't mean that this information can be applied generally. So just please don't take this one as an overall statistic across the internet. Now, so this is what we did at a time around the kind of connecting repositories, but later on, we start developing something that called Augment API. And the Augment API is similar concept, but it's actually very much driving the information from persistent identifier because of the trust that we had in the relationships of those identifiers and because of the availability of the services that enables building relationships on the fly. I'll give you an example of this. So this is a data set from the NCI, which is a data infrastructure facilities in Australia. They have a data set that called Blue Link. And this is one of their major collections in their data repository. Now, if we use the online API of just the PID providers, we can actually traverse a graph and build information, and as I'm going to show you. The researcher who worked on that data set from the NCI data, we know that is Peter Oak. We know Peter Oak has an ORCID ID. So we can actually go from the researcher in NCI to the ORCID record. Once we, so this is our kind of first level connection. Once we are in the ORCID record, we get all the publications. Once we have those publications, you can look for the data sets that are cited in those articles. And I might just oversimplify this in a more comprehensive version. There was a bit of technology involved to actually finding these relationships between the data sets and papers. But let's assume for example's sake that this just magically happens. And then you actually have the data set. Then there are other data sources like a Scholix, which is another initiative by Research Data Alliance that give you a link between the data sets and publications. So you start to building this graph. And the beauty of that is that you can build this graph dynamically because there are REST trusted API for every single of these PID providers to find the related information. Now, what does it mean for NCI? Well, for NCI, we can actually transform their GeoNetwork repository to a graph database. Then we can send this one to the research graph infrastructure. We can augment this with the information come from research graph. And then it gives you a bigger graph. Lots of blue points, which all the blue as a color coding of research graph. Blue is the publication, and orange are the data sets, and green are researchers. So most of the blue information and green ones come from the research graph augmentation API. And they kind of fill the gap. The process, as I said, is kind of in this presentation is oversimplified. It doesn't just blow out the graph with n degrees of graph crawling. It actually just fills the gap. It uses the shortest path algorithm. But regardless, this is the difference between before and after this service. So this is an NCI graph before the augmentation on the left. All the orange ones are the data sets. And using this Augment API and the power of these persistent identifier services, we complete the graph on the right. So we gave them a better picture. And this was it was possible using the PID identifiers and also PID services in that space. And because for every single of this graph would be different tomorrow compared to today as these publications and data sets and graphs are evolving. Now, with all of these technologies, what did we learn? Well, the first thing that was quite apparent to us was the persistent identifiers in a way saves money for a lot of infrastructures. So this whole journey that I mentioned in the last 10 minutes is actually like 5 years worth of investigation in different technologies. And we found there are so many ways that you can run complicated disambiguation algorithm to disambiguate authors, disambiguate titles of publications, and so forth. And all of those processes are actually very expensive if you do that live. But when you use the PIDs, it actually are encapsulated into your ecosystem. It's much, much easier to implement. And for repositories and for universities and for research groups, it's actually affordable to build added value services top of this PID infrastructure. The second thing is that not all connections have the same value. So during this time, we tested so many different methods. We use a graph clustering methods, we use topic modeling and different data mining techniques. We found, yes, with different level of accuracy, we can guess if these two papers are the same, if these two authors are the same. But just that one example that you go to the conference and present something and Joe Blog is not the same Joe Blog as you thought he is, that's just one false positive. It just put a big dent into the accuracy of the data. We're using the PIDs provided with the trusted connections because the provenance of the data is quite clear, so we know actually where that information comes from. And the other thing is that even if there is a mistake in the in the PID metadata records, still you know where is the source, so it's more kind of like fixable. So you can go there, fix it, and then that would propagate to the system. The second lesson that we learned is that in the beginning, when we were doing this about 6 years ago, it was quite tempting to just create a big graph. We just started from literally from 500 nodes to 5,000 nodes to the 5 million nodes to the 50 million nodes. As today, there are about 250 million records of scholarly communication records. And what we found very quickly is that collecting all of this information, they're not dynamic data. As we collect them, they are actually expires because the information is changing in that space. So it's kind of like you want to navigate into this. If you want to build a service that really add value, like what Ketil mentioned about different use cases, that's not about just creating a big graph. It's actually about finding and creating the fast, trusted, and sustainable services that enables innovation, and other people can actually build discovery methods that traverse this graph, traverse this big ocean of data that we have, and actually find the right answer for our users. Lesson 3, which is that was the most important one, we need to actually more invest in the business of connecting rather than collecting. So when, as I said, when we started about 6 years ago, it was quite exciting to create a big graph. And I have seen a lot of copies of these big graphs. So it's getting quite fashionable to have another curated version of this. And we have this in different shapes and forms. There are startup companies rising into this. We have different projects. But the problem statement is not to create a very large cohort of scholarly connections. That cohort is already exists. That's the network of scholarly communication that's already available across the web. The question is about how do we connect this information? So connecting here is the #1 priority, and at least the most valuable use case for any new service or any new platform that wants to leverage this ocean of data. Now, about the PID graph, so given everything that I mentioned, the Research Graph Foundation has quite a strong interest in the success of PID infrastructures and in the development of PID infrastructures. And really, the PID graph, which is a graph of identifiers underneath, is one of the key enablers for everything that we do. In that space, there's lots of collaboration between our work and FREYA. And based on that collaboration, I added a couple of slides. I think these are kind of just repeating what Ketil mentioned. But I'm just repeating my understanding from where the FREYA goes with this. That might also open the conversation in this space. That the aim of the PID graph is providing a list of federated RESTful JSON API. And these actually, the aim is that they have to be disciplinary applications, kind of ready services. So we can actually implement these services into different repositories or platforms or infrastructures. They need to be able to support the European Open Science Cloud applications. And also it needs to be able to provide enough level of dependencies in the JSON API that actually enables some level of graph visualization for the end user. Now, this is, again, another version of the use cases. This is more in the language of research graph, if you like. So there's a couple of examples. One of them is that if you have a data set across multiple different infrastructures, with multiple different versions, that actually happens a lot. In a lot of fields, the data actually has multiple versions stored in different places. We want to collect the citation for all of them, so we should be able to report all of them at once. If I have a data set and I put that data set, for example, in Fiction, and for simplicity, let's say there's only one place for it, but we have updated this data set 10 times, and there are different citations for different versions of this, given that each version has different DOI, we want to be able to accumulate all of those citations into one metric. Something similar about funding. If you have a grant and that grant actually mentioned in a data set and a publication and some other activities like research projects, and as we just learned that FREYA is working on creating a PID for the projects and grants, then we want to actually have this kind of list of connections. So we have a grant, that grant actually funded some other smaller grants or projects, produce some papers and some data sets. So it should be one place for a new service or app to go and search for all of this information rather than actually hitting 50 different APIs and try to reconsolidate the data. And the last one, I actually didn't have any mathematical model for this because it's kind of, it's one of those things that you don't know the answer until you start working on it. And what would be the most effective linking method between data and publications? And that's what it is. This is a text from one of the user stories that Ketil mentioned. As a researcher, I want an easy way to more effectively link all the data to publication. And as a reader, I want to be able to easily find all the data related to a publication. Now, there is a repository of this on GitHub that you can go and see all the FREYA work around these user stories. Some of this might lead to answer the questions of what API we want at the end and potential users. And the other thing that I think just listening to both Ketil's presentation and also my understanding from a work like this is finding the model for prioritizing the work on which API needs to be built first. Okay, so what next from here? There is a BOF that is planned for RDA Plenary 13 in Philadelphia. So the proposal is up there, but we don't know the date and the conference program. So that would be a good place to follow up this conversation. If you need more information about the project FREYA, that's website. That's a website for Research Graph, and that's my contact information. And I hope this didn't lead to so many open-ended questions, but feel free to send me an email.
Thanks a lot, Amir. Are there any burning questions to Amir right now? I don't see any, so perhaps let me show you OpenAIRE use case of PIDs, and then we can have Q&A session. Just a second. Opening my slides. Hope you can see them well. OpenAIRE is a European Commission funded project facilitating open science in Europe. Our current phase, OpenAIRE Advance, has been launched around more or less same time as FREYA. And what we do, we collect metadata about publications, data sets, software, and other research outputs from repositories of publications, from open access journals, from data repositories, software repositories, CRIS systems, and other aggregators. We do some validation, cleaning, the duplication, inferring, linking, and then we present connections between projects, authors, data sets, and other research outputs. And we have different services on top of our portal. So one of them is Scolix that was already mentioned. And we hope that this aggregated information is useful for measuring impact of research and some research trends. Obviously, we collect different types of publications from different repositories. Or, for example, from institutional repositories, we collect information about publications, articles, preprints, reports, but also, in some cases, data sets. Then from data repositories, we collect data sets. From journals and publishers, we also collect information about publications, and we are looking into software and other research products in OpenAIRE Advance to see how we can better link them to project publications. We have a content aggregation policy, and based on that content acquisition policy, we build OpenAIRE information graph. And this is what our content acquisition policy says, that OpenAIRE accepts the metadata records of all scientific products whose structure respects the model and semantics as expressed by the OpenAIRE guidelines. And this means that both open access and non-open access material will be included, and links to other products will be resolved where this is possible. And this is where we actually use PIDs, because for us, PIDs are resolvers of those links. This slide shows the role of PIDs in OpenAIRE. So it helps to identify and register content providers, it helps to identify researchers, it helps in metadata application, enrichment, and notification, because we have a service where repository managers could be notified if richer metadata is available to be added to their repositories. Then we also use PIDs for resource linking and also for resource metrics and for tracking aggregated usage statistics. We have guidelines for data providers. So originally we started with guidelines for compatible repositories with publications. Then we had guidelines for data repositories and for CRIS systems. And we're also working on guidelines for software repositories. So we sort of started from looking into publications and we're expanding into open science areas. And our guidelines help to improve interoperability of metadata information exchange. We also hope that they support fair data principle. And of course, we reuse existing standards, and this is where we extend vocabularies when necessary, for example, for different PID types. And these are some of the examples of PIDs that OpenAIRE uses for different entities. So for example, this is what we use for the resource identifier. So we extend data sites list of PID identifiers types. We also have PIDs for alternative identifiers of the resource, and you can see them listed here on this slide. And we have PIDs for related identifiers to the resource. These identifiers that are related to the registered resource. And they are listed on this slide. And then, of course, we have PIDs for authors and contributors, and they are kind of standard ones. And PIDs for funders and project grants, Crossref Funder, ISNI, and GRID. And this is an example of information displayed on the OpenAIRE search portal. So you can see a data set, and it's linked to a data set deposited in DAN's data repository, and it's also linked to an article where this data set was used. Some issues and next steps, and that's where OpenAIRE is working with, in relevant RDA working groups, and also collaborating with FREYA project. Of course, we want to improve the discovery and integration of community-specific identifiers and metadata. And we also want to improve the integration of DOI version in supported by Zenodo, which is a repository that OpenAIRE and CERN manage. So that was a quick introduction. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and it's time for your questions to Ketil, Amir, or Eliana, and Ellen from DANS, who are here with us from FREYA and OpenAIRE project as well. So yeah, I stopped screen sharing. Any questions? I don't see any coming up. It either means that we've been all very clear, or I don't know. Thank you. So there is a question, how can we follow your progress in the future?
I can answer that for FREYA at least. We have our webpage. So there, all the reports that we are producing are available. We have a list of activities also. If you want the direct day-to-day, or not day-to-day, but week-to-week interaction with us, then Twitter is a good opportunity to connect with FREYA, where you will get tweets about our upcoming activities, where we will be presented, who you can meet, and information like that.
Okay, and I can, about the research graph, I would probably say the best place always to meet everyone and get involved is the Research Data Alliance. Apart from this, are also the webinars and the website and all the other contact points. Well, yeah, as I said, usually every RDA, we either have something new or something interesting happening. So that's probably the best place to get together. Also, I just noticed we have a couple of other questions on the Q&A board. So there is one question for me is about saying something about the links between PIDs. So that's from Elian. I don't know exactly what you're asking. I can say about, I don't know, it's about this, you're asking about the statistics, that how many PIDs are connected, or if the PIDs are actually, or we are using the connections. Oh, okay, yes, around the citation and funding. So there is one thing is, so two things. One is when it gets to PIDs, that we use PIDs in two different contexts. One is that there is a metadata, there is a relationship in the metadata of the PID. DataSite, for example, has a very good corpus of these kind of connections. The APIs on that space is very good. ORCID also is the same in the same category. And Crossref started to explore the concept of the event data, which provides something similar. So the data provider tells you that these two PIDs are linked. So that's one scenario. The second scenario is that, and that's where you get things like the cited by and funded by and so forth. And there is another scenario is where there is a repository or a university research management system or a library system that in data space, a librarian said, this DOI is linked to this ORCID. So in this case, you have another authority source that actually link these two different PIDs together. So of course, in this scenario, the accuracy or the type of provenance is different around the links, but it still is much better, well, it's more trusted connection than something that just derived by AI and machine learning. So there are two different types of connections from PID. I don't know exactly if that was the question, but I'll try my best.
There was also a question from Biljana. Could you explain a little bit more about current status of PID4 organization?
I think probably Ketil is the best person to answer that.
And I'm sorry, I must pass on that one too. This is not the area that I specialize in, so I'm not going to say anything that I don't know exactly about. So I'll pass on that one, but contact me and I can put you in contact with the right people.
And then there is a question from Quentin. Is there someone specifically to discuss historical persona?
Yes, within FREYA, that is something that we have discussed, and we have ongoing discussions. So I also suggest here that you contact me, and then I'll put you in contact with the people who are concerned with personal persona. This is, I must say, a very interesting entity in terms of assigning PIDs, and I think it's challenging, difficult, but definitely needed and interesting.
Then there are two questions from Muriel. Is anyone working with Wikidata who also have lots of PIDs for people, artifacts, locations, etc., useful and relevant to research and researchers? So I know that OpenAIRE collaborates a bit with Wikidata, but unfortunately,
yes, I can also comment on that. We just started exploring some of that information. So that's one of the items, one of the kind of engagements that Research Graph explores.
And for FREYA, it's on the radar, but it's I am not familiar with the current status of our involvement.
And then also Muriel asked, anything ambassadors can do for you to help you share progress knowledge?
I think Elaine might be the right one to answer that if she would unmute.
Yes, hello everybody. This is Elian. I'm from the communications team of FREYA, and I was also co-organizing this webinar today. Yes, we are definitely looking for new ambassadors. We have an ambassador program. If you go on our website, you can find all information there. We do involve our ambassadors in webinars regularly, so we are happy to get information from you. So if you are not an ambassador yet, please go on the website and have a look.
Thank you. Then there was a question, would you recommend implementing this new PIDs in an institutional repository now or in the near future? Or what is the time frame until we could use this new PIDs actively?
Yeah, that is a very broad and a very good question. And of course, it's individual for each of the PIDs. But if you want to have an idea about the time frame, I suggest that you tune in to the report that's coming out of our analysis of these 9 PIDs that I presented earlier today. And there you'll get an idea about the current status of the development of these emerging and, in some cases, also a bit immature PIDs. And it'll get you an idea about when something could potentially come out of it. But, I mean, it's hard to say, because it's not like there's a deadline 3 years down the line and we can say, well, for instrument PIDs, in 3 years, everything is up and running. It's a development in progress, and that's always how it is. But we're definitely talking years in this case here. But I mean, in FREYA, we can work on different levels. So you heard Amir here from a technical point of view. There are some universal technological developments that is in progress and will help implement the PID services on a larger scale. And then you saw the presentation that I did just from the little last scenario from Pangea, where we implemented IGSNs. So you can say the implementation can go on at different levels. But of course, what we want to see is something that's happening more generally that can be taken up and used by the larger community, especially in terms of technological developments.
And I can comment about PIDs for instruments. There is, I don't remember, is there a working group or an interest group in RDA on this topic? So perhaps if you're interested in instruments, that's a place for you to check and maybe join some community discussions. Muriel said that he's already an ambassador, and is there anything he could do apart from sharing knowledge with his teams and colleagues? Maybe FREYA is interested in more user studies at Sydney or similar. Sheep, sorry about that. I don't know.
Jan, will you take this one, please?
Yeah.
You are muted.
Is this a question for University of Sydney? I can just add something here. Muriel, I just remember that the University of Sydney has been one of the participants in the DDRI working group way back, about 2014, 2015. There is some ongoing work in the research office in this space. I don't know about the exact user stories or use cases, how it can work, but there are some connections there to explore, and there are some possibility, some capability in place to actually connect library systems to this kind of graph modeling technology at the University of Sydney.
And I would say in regard to the user stories, then, I mean, we're definitely interested in hearing about good user stories who can illustrate what exactly it is that we are doing in connecting and paving the way for new PID services. So let us know if you have interesting user stories that we can put on our agenda and that we can move forward. I think that would be also very useful for FREYA.
Thank you. And I think we've answered all the questions received so far. Thanks a lot for joining this webinar, and apologies that we went a bit over time, but I think it was worth it. Thanks a lot, Ketil, Amir, Iryna, Ellen, for organizing this webinar. Like I said, presentations are already on the webinar page. We would also make recording available on the webinar page, and we will also upload it to OpenAIRE YouTube channel. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day, and a good weekend, and happy 2019. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you very much.